There are moments in life that feel almost unreal when they happen, moments you wish you could step outside of and watch from a distance, if only to understand how everything changed so quickly. For Sarah, that moment came on an ordinary evening in late October when the cold air seeped through the windows and the streetlights hummed faintly outside. She had just come home from work, still wearing her café apron, her hair pulled back loosely, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. She set the groceries on the counter and turned to greet her husband, Michael, expecting the usual distracted nod. Instead, he looked her up and down with eyes that held no warmth, no familiarity, and said, "You've really let yourself go, you know that?" There was no anger in his voice, no raised tone, just a sharp, steady disappointment that cut deeper than shouting ever could. And that was the moment something inside her cracked. At first, she didn't react. The words lingered in the air like smoke, bitter and impossible to ignore. The house was quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall and the soft whir of the refrigerator, but inside her, a storm was beginning to gather. She bent down to pick up one of the apples that had rolled onto the floor, her hands trembling ever so slightly, and she wondered how long he had been thinking it before he finally said it out loud. She tried to swallow the lump forming in her throat, tried to push down the sting spreading across her chest, but there was no disguising the truth, Michael didn't see her the way he used to. She set the apple on the counter and forced a smile, hoping he might soften, but he had already looked away, returning his attention to his phone as if the conversation were over. But for her, it was just beginning. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, we'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, as Sarah stood there holding that quiet ache inside her chest, she realized something painful but important, that sentence hadn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of months, maybe years, of small jabs disguised as jokes, of sidelong glances at restaurant menus, of unsolicited advice about gym memberships and portion sizes. She had brushed off each comment, believing Michael was just stressed or tired or not thinking clearly, but now she understood those excuses were simply band-aids over a wound he kept reopening. And as she made her way to the bedroom that night, she wondered how two people who once promised to love each other through every season of life could become strangers under the same roof. To understand how they reached this point, we need to go back to who they once were. Sarah grew up in a small, quiet town outside Columbus, raised by a mother who filled their home with warmth and a father who believed in teaching dignity through hard work. She had always been gentle, steady, the sort of person who noticed when someone fell behind or when someone needed encouragement. She loved simple things, the smell of warm bread rising in the oven, the comfort of hand-me-down recipes scribbled on fading index cards, the feeling of helping others. Michael, on the other hand, was ambitious from the moment he learned how to talk. He had dreams bigger than his hometown, dreams of becoming someone important, someone successful. When they met at a 4th of July picnic, he was drawn to her light-hearted laugh, and she admired his determination. They seemed to balance each other perfectly, at least at first. Their early relationship was filled with the kind of sweetness people write poems about. They spent warm evenings strolling through neighborhoods where porch lights glowed like fireflies, talking about everything from favorite childhood memories to future plans. Back then, Michael listened, not with impatience, but with genuine interest. He loved the way she described baking as an act of love, and she loved the way he spoke about building a stable, meaningful life. They shared dreams, laughed easily, and held on to each other like the world outside couldn't touch them. Their wedding was simple but beautiful, filled with family, friends, and a sense of hope that felt unbreakable. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. Responsibilities grew heavier, money got tighter, and somewhere in the rush of adulthood, they began drifting apart. The soft, gentle love that once connected them began to feel like a distant memory. After their wedding, Sarah took a job at a small cafe downtown, working long days surrounded by the aroma of fresh pastries and steaming coffee. She enjoyed the work, although it left her with aching feet and little energy by evening. Michael entered the financial world, long hours, tight deadlines, and expectations that seemed to rise with every passing month. The stress changed him, the warmth in his voice began to fade, replaced by clipped tones and heavy sighs. At first, Sarah blamed his job, telling herself that pressure made people act differently and that things would settle eventually. But as months turned into years, she noticed that the tenderness that once defined their relationship had slowly eroded. He stopped asking about her day, stopped noticing her small joys, stopped celebrating the things that once made her uniquely herself. And within that silence, she felt herself shrinking emotionally long before her body ever changed. Sarah's weight gain didn't happen overnight. It was slow, steady, almost unnoticed at first, just a few pounds from grabbing dinner late or skipping morning walks because exhaustion lingered in her bones. She didn't obsess over it, because in her heart she believed love wasn't measured by numbers on a scale. But Michael did. The first comments came subtly: "You should try lighter meals," or, "Are you sure you want scones?" At the time, she laughed them off, thinking he meant well. But as his stress grew, so did the frequency and the sharpness of his remarks. She found herself eating alone more often, hiding snacks in her car, feeling embarrassed about something that should never have been a source of shame. Still, she held on to the belief that if she just tried harder, tried to be smaller, maybe he would love her the way he once did. But love shouldn't require shrinking. Over time, Sarah realized it wasn't just her body Michael was criticizing, it was her spirit. He began comparing her to other women, sometimes directly, sometimes through passive comments about fitness or appearance. He would scroll on his phone and shake his head, muttering things she wasn't meant to hear, but did. The more he pulled away, the more she turned to food for comfort, not out of gluttony, but out of loneliness. She felt invisible in her own home, like a ghost wandering through familiar rooms without a place to rest. And though she tried explaining how his words affected her, he dismissed her feelings, saying she was too sensitive or blowing things out of proportion. Slowly, she lost pieces of herself, her laughter grew quieter, her confidence faded, and she began to believe her worth was tied to a number. But somewhere deep inside, a small part of her refused to disappear. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning that should have been peaceful. Sarah woke early to make pancakes, his favorite, hoping that maybe a simple act of love would thaw whatever coldness had settled between them. The smell of butter filled the kitchen, reminding her of better times. She placed the plate in front of him, heart quietly hopeful. But instead of gratitude, he gave her a look she couldn't quite name, something between annoyance and disgust, and said, "You should be the last person eating pancakes." He didn't say it loudly, but he didn't need to. The word struck her like a slap. She felt the heat rush to her face, the tremble in her hands, the ache in her chest. She simply nodded, turned away, and washed her hands slowly as her eyes blurred with tears she refused to let fall. That was the moment she finally realized she was done breaking for him. She didn't leave that day, not because she wanted to stay, but because sudden decisions rarely lead to lasting change. Instead, she began reflecting on her life, her marriage, and the version of herself she barely recognized anymore. One afternoon, while Michael worked late at the office, Sarah sat at the dining table with a blank sheet of paper. She didn't know why she grabbed a pen, but she felt compelled. Slowly, she wrote a single sentence: "I deserve more than this." It was the first honest thought she had allowed herself in years. She folded the paper and tucked it into her grandmother's cookbook, a place that had always held meaning for her. Something inside her was shifting, not out of revenge, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. She realized she didn't want to spend the rest of her life apologizing for existing in a body that had carried her through so much. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began waking up early, not to exercise for someone else's approval, but to reconnect with herself. She journaled each morning, exploring thoughts she had long buried under obligations and insecurities. She wrote about her dreams, her fears, her childhood moments spent baking beside her grandmother, who taught her that food was love, not punishment. She remembered how alive she felt in those moments, her hands covered in flour, her heart full of possibility. Gradually, that old spark began to return. One quiet morning, she reached for her grandmother's cookbook, opened it to a familiar page. On others, young children pressed their noses to the glass, wide-eyed in wonder. And every time she handed someone a warm loaf or a carefully decorated cupcake, she felt like she was giving away a piece of her heart, only now, she had learned that giving didn't mean losing. It meant sharing. One quiet afternoon, as she was closing the shop, she noticed a familiar figure standing outside the window, Michael. He looked thinner than before, but not in a way that suggested discipline or intention. His shoulders slumped forward as if something heavy rested on them. His eyes carried a tiredness she recognized because she had once carried it herself. When she opened the door, he attempted a smile, but it faltered halfway. There was a long pause, one that carried years of unspoken apologies, regrets, and what-ifs. He finally asked if they could talk, his voice soft, humbled in a way she had never encountered. She agreed, not out of affection or longing, but out of a newfound strength that made her unafraid of the person who once dimmed her light. They sat at a small table inside, and Michael struggled to find the right words. He admitted he had been wrong for the jokes, wrong for the cruelty disguised as teasing, wrong for thinking her worth was tied to her size instead of her character. He confessed that after she left, the house felt colder. He found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at empty counters where her laughter used to echo. He told her that sometimes, in the quietest moments of the night, he replayed the last argument they ever had, wishing he could change every word he said. But as he spoke, she felt no anger, not anymore. The pain he had caused was real, but she had walked too far, grown too much, and healed too deeply to allow old wounds to reopen. She told him, gently, that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. It meant freedom. Freedom for him, and freedom for her. And she explained that the love she once begged him to see had not disappeared. It had simply been redirected, poured into her craft, her growth, her community, and most importantly, herself. Michael nodded slowly, tears filling his eyes, realizing at last that some lessons arrive too late, and some people learn the value of what they had only after it is already gone. He left the shop quietly, and she watched him walk away without bitterness. His departure felt like the final page turning in a very long chapter. Later that night, as she returned home and set her tea mug in the sink, she whispered a small thank you, to the universe, to God, to whatever force had pulled her through. Not because she was grateful for the pain, but because she had survived it and built something beautiful in its place. She opened her bedroom window to let in the cool evening air, and she breathed deeply, feeling the crisp breeze fill her lungs like a reminder that she was still alive, still growing, still deserving of every good thing coming her way. She lay in bed, wrapped in soft blankets, and replayed the journey she had taken, the girl who cried in silence, the woman who dared to leave, the baker who rebuilt her life one loaf at a time. And for the first time in a long time, she fell asleep smiling. Before we close this chapter of her story, let me ask you something. If you were in Sarah's place, would you have found the courage to walk away when everything inside you whispered to stay? How would you handle someone who tears you down until you no longer recognize yourself? And what part of her journey touched you the most, the heartbreak, the transformation, or her quiet moment of victory? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. And that, dear listener, is how life sometimes teaches its most powerful lessons, not through revenge or anger, but through growth, healing, and the strength to choose you.